Good evening. Welcome to Sunday Night Live. We're kind of light on Sunday Night Live tonight. It could be that there's 63 of us. Well, some of them got back. Well, some of the 63 I'm sure are not back yet because they probably made a Culver's run on the way back or something. And if you've ever waited in Culver's drive-thru, then you know why it's taking them time to get back, okay? So it is good to see everybody here tonight on a beautiful spring Sunday. Hasn't it been great? Beautiful day. Well, tonight we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 12. And Romans 12 is an interesting text when we start where we are in about verse 9 through the end of the chapter, because it's not written like most portions of the Apostle Paul's letters. It's really kind of a bunch of wisdom advice as far as what it means to live the Christian life, all kind of meshed together. It kind of reminds me of studying the book of Proverbs, where you'll study through one chapter and it'll give you advice on 100 different things, but every word of it is true and every word of it is necessary and helpful. So we're going to turn over there in just a moment. Before we do, though, I want to encourage you, if you haven't seen these in the pew yet, these little blue Members' Notes of Encouragement cards. Okay, what this is you can take it and you can just write who it's to, write your name on behind from. Everybody knows how that works, right? And then just write one or two sentences of encouragement. So if you see a young person in the congregation that you just want to tell them, I think you're doing well. Or a mother and father that you just think they're raising their kids well and they might benefit from an encouraging word. Or if you want to say thank you to one of the elders. They do so much behind the scenes. The deacons, the same thing. One of the new men who are about to be put up as a deacon, if you just want to give them a word of support and encouragement, write their name down. If you want to encourage Daniel or Tom or anybody in the congregation, the folks who sit across from you in the pew. You know, Berlin, Doyle might need a little encouragement. You never can tell. And so whatever it may be, what you do is you just fill that out and you drop it in the collection plate Sunday morning, Sunday night, and they'll be mailed to the people who are receiving them. And it's a great encouragement. So please keep that in mind and make us have to print more than we ever have. We want them all to be gone every single week. That'd be a great problem to have. Since this entire section is about what it means to live our day-by-day Christian life, I thought a good song for us to sing tonight would be 676. Number 676. And before we read it, let's meditate for just a moment on the words. Living for Jesus, a life that is true, and striving to please Him in all that I do. Yielding allegiance, glad-hearted and free, this is the pathway of blessing for me. Living for Jesus, who died in my place, bearing on Calvary my sin and my disgrace. Such love constrains me to answer His call and follow His leading and give Him my all. Living for Jesus through earth's little while, my dearest treasure, the light of His smile. The lost ones He died to redeem, bringing the weary to find rest in Him. O Jesus, Lord and Savior, I give myself to Thee. For Thou in Thine atonement didst give Thyself for me. I own no other master. And this is my favorite line in the song. My heart shall be Thy throne. My life I give henceforth to live, O Christ, for Thee alone. Living for Jesus, a life that is true, striving to please Him in all that I do, yielding allegiance, glad-hearted and free. This is the pathway of blessing for me. Oh, Jesus, Lord and Savior, I give myself to Thee, for Thou in Thine atonement didst give Thyself for me. I owe no other master, my heart shall be Thy throne. My life I give henceforth to live, O Christ, for Thee alone. Living for Jesus, who died in my place, bearing on Calvary my sin and disgrace. Such love constrains me to answer His call and follow His leading and give Him my all. Oh, Jesus, Lord and Savior, I give myself to Thee, for Thou in Thine atonement didst give Thyself for me. I owe no other master, my heart shall be Thy throne. My life I give henceforth to live, O Christ, for Thee alone. Living for Jesus, through earth's little while, my dearest treasure, the light of His smile. Seeking the lost ones, He died to redeem, bringing the weary to find rest in Him. Oh, Jesus, Lord and Savior, I give myself to Thee, for Thou in Thine atonement didst give Thyself for me. I owe no other master, my heart shall be Thy throne. My life I give henceforth to live, O Christ, for Thee alone. Well, in essence, we've got the message of Romans chapter 12 just by examining and reflecting the words of that powerful song. But as we turn over to the text, Paul has already discussed what it means to be a living sacrifice. As we sang just a moment ago, I give myself to Thee. My allegiance wholly and completely, my heart shall be Thy throne. What could possibly express the idea of being a living sacrifice for Him every day of our life? And then he continues on, and you'll remember last week we discussed extensively what it means to be a part of the body. And each and every one of us have a different place within the body. But that in Christ, in the church, every single member of the body, just like in your physical body, has worth and value to the whole. I mentioned to you that none of us, if we offered free surgery, nobody in here would say, yeah, I've got this pinky that doesn't work right all the time. Let's just get rid of that problem. Nobody volunteers to have any part of your body removed. You know why? Because you cherish every single part. You know how I know this? Because if you hit your finger with a hammer, or if you stub your toe on a door frame, or if you fall and scrape your knee, it doesn't matter what part of your body you hurt, the whole body responds, right? Every single part of the body responds. That's why we've been singing on Sunday nights, when one has a heartache, we all shed a tear. Because the whole body responds. Because every part of the body is equally important to the whole. And that's what the world can't understand. Role in the church, in the kingdom, role is different than worth. In our world, they always tie the two the same. Your worth to your company is dependent upon your role. That's why at General Motors, some of you are a level 5. And some of you are a level 8. Some of you may be a level 31. I don't know how many levels there are. But I know this, they consider a level 8 to be more important than a level 5. Right? And Eagle Scout's more important than other scouts. The lesser scouts. I don't know all the scouts even. I'm not very good at this, apparently. But, in the military, I know this, a captain's above a lieutenant. And they're considered more valuable. You see, our world, in every area of our world, in every other organization in this world, role and worth are the same thing. But not here. The preacher has a different role. But I'm telling you, he is no more valuable to God or to the kingdom than anybody sitting here tonight. Anybody. From the youngest to the oldest. From the feeblest to the strongest. The elders, they have the authority to govern the church in this world. But they, individually, they're not more important. They don't have a greater worth. Because role and worth only are tied together in the world, not in the kingdom of God. Which brings us to this section starting in verse 9, where he's going to mash together a lot of different instructions about life. And the only thing I know to do with this text I tried to outline, it was an outline with 30 points, so it didn't work very well. So I think we're going to do this, conduct it kind of like a Bible study. We're going to walk through it and talk about each one of these suggestions. But I want to tell you that I believe that they paint an overall picture of a certain kind of life. A certain type of governance of what kind of life we desire. What we're trying to mold and become as living sacrifices, which is the theme of this chapter. He starts off and he says, in verse 9, let love be without hypocrisy. Let love be without hypocrisy. Are there hypocritical kinds of love? Remember, hypocrisy means acting. So a love that is filled with hypocrisy is a love that is faked. It's a love that is faked. It's a love where you paint on a smile and you're really, really sweet to somebody because maybe being sweet to them benefits you in some way or another. That's a hypocritical kind of love. He says, not here. Let your love be, let it be genuine. See, that's the opposite of hypocrisy. Sincere. Genuine. Let it be real. Let it be without hypocrisy and abhor what is evil. That's a word we don't use very often. Abhor. That basically means just it disgusts you. Abhor what is evil. Now this is an important point because as we go through the rest of the chapter, what will be made clear is how we define this and how we separate things is going to be very important. Because sometimes how people have applied abhor what is evil, it would mean that they abhor people who do evil. Do you know that we should be the people who are constantly wrestling with the practice of hating the sin and loving the sinner? You see, the problem with wicked people is the wicked part, not the people part. Right? The problem with people in our world that we look and we see that we can't believe some of the things they engage in their lives to their own destruction. And then we look and we turn on the television and we see what comes out of Washington, or we see what comes out of Lansing, or whatever it may be, and we say, how can anybody think that's good? And we have to be careful to remember that just as we sang in the last verse of that song, our purpose and the reason He'll tell us to live this life is so we can reach the people. But it is possible. Now, it takes effort. It takes conscientious duty to be able to separate and be a people who abhor what is evil, but love people who are still in their sins. And you know you have an example. Because Jesus didn't tolerate evil, but you know who He ate with? Sinners. You know, he was constantly being criticized. I find that interesting because sometimes in the church I've heard people say, well, you know, we need to watch who we're around because of the influence we'll have on other people and what other brethren may think. Jesus didn't much care about that. But here's the problem. Sometimes when believers are wanting to associate with unbelievers, it's because they really aren't thinking about being an influence. They're going to be influenced. Now, as we raise our children, this is an issue. Because that's a balancing act, isn't it? Raising kids today, you need to pray for all of these young mothers and young fathers who are raising kids and encourage them. Write them those blue notes. There's a good opportunity. Because it's tough. Because they have to balance two things. Our God did not want us to have our children raised outside of this world. Did you know that? He could have done that if He'd wanted. In fact, He said of His disciples, Lord, do not remove them from the world, but keep them from the world. God intended that you be in the mix of all the filth. Did you know that? And your kids too. But that you not be stained by the filth. That we be in the world, but not of the world. Just imagine, you go out to Lake Huron or Lake Michigan and you take an empty bottle and you throw it as far as you can when it's not winter and it's not frozen over, okay? As far as you can out into the waves. And that bottle may make it to Chicago. Because it'll bob right there on the surface as long as one thing doesn't happen. You see, the bottle can be in the water and it'll always rise above until the water gets in the bottle. The problem with believers is not being in a wicked world. The problem is when we allow the wickedness to get inside of us. And that's when it consumes us. That's true of us and our children. So pray for young families because they're having to balance this. You know, my kids have to live in this world, but I have to prepare them to live in this world. I have to, there's some things I have to separate them from and keep them from until they're older. And, that's tough. It's tough. And while we do so, He says, abhor what is evil. But then what does He say? And cling to what is good. Love those things that are good and noble and right. But we get so caught up sometimes in the things that are evil that even when we hear something good, we can't really adore it. We can't applaud it and appreciate it because we're so caught up in the bad. Have you seen people like that, right? Who they can't see the silver lining, they can't see the good because they're so consumed with the bad. Sometimes I think believers are that way. About a month ago, this big scandal came out about the people who were the movie stars and rich people who were trying to get their kids into these expensive schools, right? And everybody's been talking about that. And I'll tell you, to me, I guess I look at things weird, but I was so encouraged when that story came out. There were two things about that were super encouraging to me about our society. Things I didn't know about our society. I suspected it was worse than it is. First of all, Those folks didn't just donate the money to those schools because that's legal. You can do that. I mean, you can write a check to Harding University for $1 million and I bet your kid gets in. I mean, it's just part of it. But apparently you can't do that with some of these schools that they were trying to get their kids into. So they had to cheat. I mean, they paid a coach $700,000. Why didn't they just write that check to the school? That's legal. Because, read between the lines, there are still some institutions in this nation that can't be bought. That's what that means. Because these are the richest people who wanted to buy them. They couldn't. So they had to cheat. That's a good thing. The second thing is the Federal Bureau of Investigation is prosecuting some of the richest people in this country and embarrassing them on national TV. And it's not just, somebody say, yeah, but it's probably political. Well, no, because I was curious. So I looked up the political affiliations of some of the different people. It's all over the map. Right, left, Democrats, Republicans. I mean, it's just justice. But a lot of folks that I've talked to about it, they didn't even see that stuff. They just said, look at people, they're trying to buy. Yes, people are evil. But we need to like the things that we see that are good and abhor the things that we see that are bad. But you got to be able to tell the difference to do that. And that means you have to have a clear mind. Be able to see things as they are. And so, he says, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love. In honor, giving preference to one another. Now this cannot be underemphasized. Jesus said, by this all men will know you're my disciples, by the love you have for one another. And I think that's one of the things that makes this congregation so special. You people legitimately love each other. Regardless of what background you come from, regardless of what your life has looked like before, regardless of your education level or your socioeconomic status, I see more. Now, we've got room to grow. Don't take that as, no, we've got room to grow. We're not perfect at it. But we're trying. And I'll tell you, any congregation that does that one verse will grow. Because that just doesn't exist in the world. The idea of preferential treatment. That means treating one another as better than yourself. Being concerned for the welfare of each other, first and foremost. And he doesn't just say with love. He says with affection. Affection's different. You can love people you're not affectionate towards. My Uncle Kenneth, I loved him. But he was a hard guy to be affectionate with. He was my gruff uncle who farmed in Kentucky all of his life and fought in the Korean War and thought that his farm was saved by aliens. I'm not joking. And you just couldn't argue with him about it because he was always right about everything, even the aliens. And I loved Uncle Kenneth. But it was how you doing, Uncle Kenneth? Now, some of my other uncles, my Uncle Wayman, it's embracing and loving, and just when you've been apart, it's just joy. The thing is, though, is the book of Proverbs says, if a man would be friendly, if a man would have friends, he must show himself to be friendly. I'll tell you, when folks come and visit a new congregation, especially when they come and visit here, and this doesn't happen very often here because we pretty much excel at this, but there are those who sometimes walk in and who might say, well, not very many people talk to me. Well, did you show yourself to be friendly? I'll give you a hint. If you move from here ever and you want to really get involved in a church, don't just walk in, sit down, and wait for people to come up and see how many people speak to you. You speak to people. Make yourself friendly, and most of the time people will be friendly to you. And he says here we should have not just love, but affection for each other. That's what that whole greet one another with a holy kiss thing is. It's about affection. I don't think we're going to start that policy here. Because we can accomplish it with Okay, Jeff, let's start it right now, man. First of all, if us fellas started kissing on the ladies, we'd have a problem. And if we started kissing on the men, we'd have a bigger problem, right? So we're going to be careful with that. But culturally, we do the same thing, right? I see people, there are more hugs distributed in this building, and warm handshakes and pats on the back and blue cards written and dropped in the collection plate. Affection. Affection. Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. What does diligence mean? That's just a fancy way of saying getting stuff done. Of saying getting to work. Being disciplined about your responsibilities. Serving in diligence. Serving the Lord. Rejoicing in hope. Patient in tribulation. Continuing steadfastly in prayer. I believe every church should be a place that overall people say, my congregation where I worship is positive and filled with hope. Of all the people in the world, we're the only people in the world who really have any hope. So of all the people in the world, who should be most optimistic? Who should be most filled with the joyous expectation of future? It should be the people of God. We should have an attitude and an atmosphere that looks boldly to the future because we know who holds the future. Fervent in spirit, passionate, excited about the things of God, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly, filled with prayer, being a people who constantly take things before the Father. And this doesn't mean in the public assembly. This means living lives of praying without ceasing. Now that text has been applied, and I thought no one could ever live up to that. But it doesn't mean that we pray every moment. It means that prayer is sprinkled and symbiotically connected to every aspect of our life. That you pray in the morning, and you pray in the afternoon, you pray when you're driving, you pray when you're showering, you pray when you're working, you pray when you're fishing. Doesn't mean you're praying every minute. It means your life is filled with prayer. And then he says we pray, we distribute, verse 13, to the needs of the saints. We're given to hospitality. How can we be affectionate with one another if we don't want to be with one another? And hospitality can mean a lot of things. It can mean having people into your home. We do a lot of that because my wife she likes to clean the house. She won't tell you she does, but she always has, so I figure she likes it. Some people don't. It's not their thing. That's why God created Applebee's, for Christian fellowship. Or breakfast places, or whatever it may be. And that's why we have potlucks, and that's why we have fish fries, and that's why we have raccoon dinners. Oh, that's not what it's called. What's it called? Wild game dinner. Or raccoon dinner, whichever one you want to call it. We have all of these things for the purpose of hospitality, which gives opportunity for real affection. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Bless those who persecute you. We are not a people who hold grudges. Because you know what? We have an awareness of what we've been saved from. And if we understand how much He's forgiven us of, it is absolutely absurd to not be willing to forgive. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. A family, as we mentioned, as a body, we rally around whichever part of the body is in need. Be of the same mind toward one another. Don't set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. What good advice. And you know, this is good advice because high things and high people aren't as fun to be with as humble people. You know, they really aren't. Humble people, man, it's just a joy. It's a joy. And do not be wise in your own opinion. We talked about that extensively last week. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. And if possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. You know, we could, and there's more there, but we're running out of time. But I just want to summarize with that statement. If possible, as much as is possible for you. And he says that because sometimes you just can't. You know, there are times when you try to make peace with people and they just don't allow it. But he says, if it's at all possible, you be a people who are at peace with all men. That means you don't get into debates with people that you don't have to get into debates with. Religious, political, football teams. The third one's usually the most intense, by the way. You just don't do that. You know why? Because you're commanded to live at peace with people if at all you can. That means we're people who are nice people. You know, that's the biggest key to being evangelistic. Be nice. We're God's people. This describes a people who are sweet and gentle and kind and good. Not perfect, but sweet, gentle, kind, and good. And this text, as I was reflecting on this text this week, I came to a realization in my life in the church. We've talked about what holy living means. And I remember growing up, it was kind of preached about the things you do and the things you don't. You don't curse. You don't drink. You don't smoke. And, you know, you don't engage in lustful activity. You don't commit adultery. You don't commit fornication. You go to church. You give. All of these things. And all of that's true. That's all part of godly living. But is that the summation of godly living? Because you notice this passage is all about being a living sacrifice. And there's hints as to the kind of things we do and we don't do, but that's not his emphasis here. What's his emphasis? What kind of character you have. You realize the Pharisees had the whole things you do and things you don't do on pretty good. And they were the people Jesus had the biggest problem with. Because their, quote, holiness was not filtered through a life of sincere Christian character. When my grandfather died, his house was worth, I think they sold his house for like $13,000 after he died. It was just old and he'd built it with his own hands and it just wasn't worth very much. He had a couple $100 in his bank account. He lived hand to mouth every week. Never had any money his whole life. But through the years, he ran a junkyard there in Metropolis, Illinois. And he was the guy you came to if you needed an alternator. Or I guess they called them generators back in the day. And I remember as a boy, I'd go and my grandpa would always give me a new pocket knife because he had a drawer. And I'd open up that drawer and it was just a treasure trove for a little boy. It had Barlow knives and it had, all sorts of case pocket knives and some pocket watches and other little trinkets. And I asked him, where'd you get all this, Grandpa? He said, fellas would need parts and I'd just trade them. People couldn't afford their parts. My grandfather, nobody ever left the junkyard without the part they needed, regardless of how much money they had. And I remember my dad telling me a story when my dad was a boy that my grandpa, it was still a time in that part of the country where there was a lot of prejudice and a lot of bigotry. And my grandpa had been raised in that world. But he had several men, 3 or 4 or 5 men who worked for him on the junkyard. And there was one, an African-American man, who worked for my grandpa. And Grandpa appreciated so much the hard work he did. And he was being mistreated by some of the other workers. And so in a time where this didn't happen, my dad remembers as a boy, they would eat at the table at lunchtime, and it'd be my daddy and his brother and my grandma and my grandpa and that man. Because my grandpa said, you're just going to come in and eat with us if they're not going to treat you right. And when my grandfather died at 96 years old, the line for his visitation stretched 2.5 blocks. And what they said as they came through the reception line was, your grandpa, Jimmy, was just a good man. My grandpa had an 8th grade education, and he didn't know a whole lot about the Bible. His extent of theological understanding was when my daddy got pneumonia and the doctor said he might not live through the night, my grandpa went out and made a bargain with God he'd stop smoking if he saved his boy's life. Never smoked another cigarette because, he made a deal. That's not a deep theological understanding of spiritual things, but he was a good man. And that's what this text, he was a nice man. He was a giving man. And I hope to be more like him. What does it mean to live for Jesus as a living sacrifice? Does it mean to live righteously? Yes, we strive for that every day. But more than that, it means to live a life of character. Of character. If you have any needs tonight, if you examine your life and you say, I need to live more humbly, or I need to be a little nicer. That text had so many things that challenge each and every one of us. Whatever it is you need, we're family. Every part of us matter. You matter. And we can help you. If we can pray with you, encourage you, we want to. If you come right now as we stand and as we sing.